Support for this episode comes from the Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards. The deadline is approaching for the Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards, honoring young changemakers who embody the value of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. Up to 15 recipients from across the U.S. will receive $36,000 each for their leadership efforts to change the world. Nominate a teen today, or they can apply directly by January 9th, 2025. Learn more at dillerteenawards.org.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 461, Jewish Kink, Power and Belonging. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And our guest today is Leora Fridman, a writer whose work is concerned with issues of identity, care, disability, and embodiment, and the author of a fascinating new book called Bound Up on Kink, Power and Belonging. Before we dive into this conversation, we have an exciting announcement. Count them, 4 new 3-week mini-courses are going to be starting in the Yeshiva, our Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning, in just a few weeks. The Yeshiva is a place where folks who enjoy the Judaism Unbound podcast can dig even deeper into the topics that we cover with some of our amazing podcast guests. The classes are now posted on our website, judaismunbound.com/classes, and you can register for them now. The first class we're going to be offering is called Judeo-Futurism with Becca Levis. The second class is called Queering Theology, a crash course in reading the Bible queerly with Brian G. Murphy and Shannon T. L. Kearns. The third class is called Sabbatean Heresy, Shabtai Tzvi, and Permitting the Forbidden with Chava de Cordova. And finally, while all our classes are exciting, this one is super exciting because it's a chance to study with the second ever guest on the Judaism Unbound podcast, Vanessa Oakes. She is going to be teaching a class called Jewish Ritual Lab, Experiments in Jewish Creativity and Invention. You're not going to want to miss that, and you're not going to want to miss any of these classes. As always, financial aid is available for all of the classes, and you can get a lot more details and register at our website, judaismunbound.com/classes. So now let's jump into today's conversation. Our guest today, Leora Fridman, is the author of Bound Up on Kink, Power, and Belonging. And that's the jumping off point for our conversation. You know, so many themes that are present in conversations about kink, including dominance and submission, and even the notion of being bound, as in the titles Bound Up, or Judaism Unbound, of course, they've been important to our conversations about alternative Jewish futures. And as much as we've tried to be a space that's all about transcending boundaries and questioning taboos, the intersection of Jewishness and kink has not yet been a centerpiece of a podcast episode, so we're thrilled to be changing that today. A bit more about Leora Fridman. In addition to Bound Up, she is also the author of Static Palace, a collection of essays about chronic illness, art, and politics, and she is the author of My Fault, which was the winner of the Cleveland State University Press First Book Prize, as well as other books of prose, poetry, and translation. Leora Fridman has taught for institutions including Columbia University, Mount Holyoke College, and St. Lawrence University, as well as teaching in homes and retreat centers, and she collaborates widely with artists, writers, and community groups. In addition to writing and teaching, Leora Fridman curates exhibitions of contemporary art and performance and consults with artists and creative organizations. She's currently faculty at the Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts at the New School, and she is the director of the New Jewish Culture Fellowship. Leora Fridman holds degrees from the University of Massachusetts Amherst MFA program for poets and writers, and from Brown University. She's a recipient of support and honors from organizations including Fulbright, Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Center for Cultural Innovation. Leora Fridman, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I was thinking about your book. You know, a few weeks ago, in the traditional Torah reading cycle, we read the story of the binding of Isaac. Mm-hmm. It's one of these topics that I remember in the early days when we were coming up with the name of this podcast, and it was Judaism Unbound. We had some ideas about what Unbound was about, but over the first weeks and over the first year, I remember just discovering more and more layers of the word unbound that I hadn't really understood or hadn't really been thinking about. And so I was thinking about when we have this story in the Bible about this ancestor who is bound up. I think a lot of us have asked about that Torah portion, like, what is the point of it? What is the work that it's doing? What is its project? And I whether it's specifically making the connection to the Binding of Isaac, I wanted to open with a similar question about your project, about Bound Up. And what is the project? What are you trying to achieve by exploring what you're exploring in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good question. And I've had people ask me questions before about, what this book is or why the title, but I've actually never had it framed through the Binding of Isaac before. So I really love this additional stream. So the project uses the frame of kink and role play to consider identity, very broadly spoken, to consider what it means to take on and off identities as history moves, as bodies move through space, how our relationship to history changes through our context as history moves forward, et cetera. And there are moments in the book when I'm talking about a variety of different aspects of kink and role play, and there are some moments specifically that focus on rope play as opposed to rope play, so the binding of ropes in that particular sense. But I also think so much of the book is really concerned with an analysis of text and an analysis of language, how we learn to tell the stories that we tell ourselves that have been told to us, how this happens through books, through bound books in that sense, through the binding of relationship, through the bounds of relationship, through the bonds of relationship. That's a little bit of a stretch because it's no longer the same root as bound, but I'm just leaning into it anyway. So there are a lot of different connections there. And I think ultimately the project is really concerned with what holds us together and how we hold ourselves together as individuals and as a people, as peoplehoods. And I'm interested also, and I'm curious if you have thoughts on this too, in particularly when you're bringing up the Binding of Isaac, I'm thinking also about part of what's always troubled me in that story and made it a difficult text for me is the violence of it, the intimate violence of that particular portion, and how, not in the same way, but I do think that my book is very much concerned with violence as an intimate act. Violence is something that gets incorporated into all of our bodies in different ways through different forms of oppression and through, again, different relationships to history and to inherited trauma. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts also on kind of what it means to hold that intimate violence in that story right now.
It's a great question. I think that, right, because some people look at a story like that as history. Yeah. And they're like, yeah, this happened. God said to Abraham, bind up your son and offer him as a sacrifice. And that's what the story is telling. Or maybe they'll say something like, I don't know if it's true or not, but there was this legend in the community, and at some point they wrote it down. For me, it's a different thing. Like, for me, it's like somebody chose to write that story. Mm-hmm. Why did they want to write a story about a person being bound up?
And by the way, I don't want to, Dan, you should keep going, but not only did somebody choose to write the story, but also later folks chose to center it on one of the prime days of the Jewish calendar, Rosh Hashanah.
Sure. And maybe the same dynamic is also going on when people are choosing whether or not to give primacy to this story and give it a central role. But I'm even talking about the creative impulse of the person who wrote the story. Why did they want to write a story about somebody being made unable to have a choice in what was happening to them? Like, why was that something that, in a certain way, we're not talking in this story, we're not talking about sex, or at least not directly, but we're talking about in the activities that were being done, in this particular case, writing and telling stories, right? Somebody chose to tell a story about somebody who was being restrained, right? Being bound in that way. And then, the choice that the other person in the story has as to how to relate to all that. And I guess two other characters in the story, God and Abraham. And I'm curious about how you would, we're going back and forth here, but I'm curious like how you make the connection. I also want to, just for listeners who aren't really, in the depths of the terminology that we're using, when we talk about kink and role play, just to make sure that people understand what we're talking about in terms of what's happening sexually in those kinds of situations. But then how do you look at what people may be doing in those ways day to day and saying, I'm seeing deeper significance in this?
Yeah. It has been important to me to say, as I've been touring with this book, that this is not a book by someone who is a professional in kink or even an expert in such, although certainly I have gained my share of information as I've gone along. But really, the way that this text is oriented is you're along for the ride with someone while they're learning about something, while they're approaching something. So the character who is me of many years ago in this book begins from a moment of trying to understand why my own identity was suddenly becoming so fluid in a certain sense. And I'll explain what I mean by that in particular. In particular, in the book, it has to do with a moment in my life when I was living in Oakland, California, and also spending a lot of time in Berlin, in Germany. And I was really involved in Black Lives Matter movements and really examining my own whiteness and my own proximity to police oppression and my own, in that sense, proximity to the side of the oppressor and a victim-oppressor dynamic. And then I was spending a lot of time in Berlin in a situation in which I was immediately coded as the victim, historically, kind of bombastically so. And I was going back and forth between these social dynamics and feeling really strange about it and feeling like, how could this change so quickly just with a flight? I mean, it's a long flight, but it's a flight, you know? And as I started to wonder about that, I started to think, I mean, as a person oriented towards text and learning, whenever I become obsessed with something or interested in something, I try to think about who knows better about this than I do, who's an expert in this. As a person who's avowedly has no expertise, is an avowed generalist, and is interested in kind of crossing genre and expertise, I am very much holding respect for people who do have that expertise. So as I was thinking about that, I was like, you know, the people who really know about this experience of roles suddenly switching, roles feeling performative, identities feeling performative, are people who take on specific roles in role play and sexual role play. And I had heard about some of those things. I had not been exposed to them in depth. And so I started to read specifically about role play and sexual kinks that engage with racialization and that engage with historical trauma. Most of the material about that is about slave master kink, is about Blackness. There's very little that touches on Jewishness in particular, or on Nazis or historical fascism in Germany. But that was my initial entry into kink, to use it as an example of people who treat identity performatively and take that as a stance for learning.
So I want to start by saying that I really liked your book a lot. Mm-hmm. And it was not what I thought it was going to be when I started reading it. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that both because, you know, we've got listeners that hopefully will buy the book and like, oh, I'll give a window into what at least I thought it was and then what it was in reality. But I think that what I was expecting to some extent, and I'm not, like, this isn't a slight, I was expecting there to be like an analysis mm-hmm. of how kink and Jewishness interplay, how kink, power, belonging intertwine with Jewish identity. This wasn't really that. And there were a lot of seeds planted where I think in this conversation we can sort of strive or reach towards that realm of conversation, because I think not just to the binding of Isaac, but I think to key moments of liturgy. Like there's a moment where we kick off the Yom Kippur service by saying that all in the room are permitted to pray with transgressors. You could even translate it as sinners. You know, a lot of Jews love to say that we're not about, you know, sin, or certainly not about original sin in a Christian sense. And I do think that the question of transgression is really pivotal. And transgression, we forget, like, let's get linguistic for a second. Transgression is not only a word that means to like go against rules. One also transgresses a boundary in the sense of one crosses over from one boundary to another. That's why, you know, Jericho Vincent, a past guest on this podcast, teacher in the Young Yeshiva, they talk very regularly about the word Ivrim, which is the word for Hebrews, kind of meaning those who transgress boundaries. And so I am kind of excited to think with you, not that this is what your book is precisely about like the Jewish relationship to kink. Is there something there? Help me start to grasp in that direction, because your book plants a lot of seeds there, but I still actually don't feel like I have a window into how you'd describe that.
Yeah, I mean, my book, not only am I not an expert in kink, what I am primarily is a writer of creative nonfiction. And I think that it is always a ripe time to think about how literature or when literature is an analysis and when it is not, when it is an opening, when it is an opportunity to think with. That is very much my orientation towards kink as well, is really to consider it as a place of beckoning and permission. And I think it would be interesting for us to get more specific together about what that means Jewishly. But I guess one thing I would say as an opening, and as a response also to this offering that you give of the Yom Kippur permission to be with transgressors, is that for me, part of the fertile space of kink and role play is a space where we get to try things that are generally not considered permitted, that are generally considered taboo and transgressive, to use that terminology. And we're using them very purposefully. We're using them to beckon particular forms of desire or to dismiss particular forms of desire or hatred in the case of the territory that this book also works in. And so I'm thinking about that example you gave and how forthrightly we need to tell ourselves that we are allowed to be with transgressors or that we are allowed to be with transgression. And I think that we're also living in a time right now where we're really very rarely allowed to be wrong or allowed to be in the gray area, which again is another part of my desire for the kind of text that I write and that I work with, because I really want to be in spaces where people are allowed to try things on. I really want to be in spaces where people can design a scene with someone, to use how we speak about these things in kink. Design a scene, meaning decide what roles people are going to take and how they're going to take them, if they're any kind of tools that they're going to use or particular objects or imaginary landscape that's taking place, to design those together really intentionally, try them together, experiment with how those experiences fall on each of their bodies, and then process afterwards how it went. Was it good? Was it bad? Did it achieve what it was supposed to? Did it not? Does something else need to be done? And this kind of process is permission to be wrong in a certain way that I find very, very difficult to find generally in my own lived experience.
I'm really caught by the word permission here. I think that when we talk about kink, the word that ends in mission people think of first is submission, more than permission. And that's not bad or wrong. I am interested in exploring the power questions. I mean, you've got these three big words in your title: kink, power, belonging. I think the power word starts to bring us towards questions of dom, sub, dominance, and submission. I mean, some of our listeners may be aware of what that terminology refers to in a BDSM sense. Others might not. Again, I have a suspicion that the ways we talk about unbinding Judaism, about a more liberated Judaism, I have a suspicion that there's a framework of terminology we haven't been using that relates to dominance, submission, that we could be using as Judaism Unbound. And so I'm kind of wondering if you can help us grapple towards it.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing I would bring up around that is that I know that there is one particular study sheet that has been emailed to me many times that was put together by Rabbi Monica Gomery about dominance and submission in Jewish text. There's so much, like you're saying, Lex, there's so much richness in the possibility of thinking about dominance and submission in terms of God language, in terms of what we think about what gathers a peoplehood. I'm thinking also about Dan's question earlier about why someone would choose to write a foundational story that involves such depth of submission. The first place that my mind goes in that is just what is required to form a peoplehood or an understanding of peoplehood, which is really swallowing a narrative, swallowing a certain kind of story, to use perhaps slightly crass terminology in this sense. To answer your question, Lex, when I'm using these terms, dominance and submission, I'm thinking about traditionally people who control power or give up control of power in a physical sense. And this can cover lots of different things in the realm of kink. What sex entails can mean lots of different things that I think are different than what people usually think of when they think of sex. So a kinky scene might not actually involve any form of penetration of any sort. It might involve an exchange of power and control between two people, but that is both the expression and completion of their desire, whether it's rope, like we were talking about earlier, one person naming their desires and the other person refusing to give those to that person. I'm also really thinking about the role of the submissive and submission in particular as a way into also understanding Jewish assimilation and identity, like what it has meant to submit to whiteness, what it has taken to submit to whiteness, particularly for white passing American Jews, and how that involves a proximity to power and oftentimes an actual holding of power and privilege, and oftentimes how it has also at different moments in history involved a proximity of power that actually is quite submissive, that involves giving up all power to a king or something like that. If you're working inside of a court and you're very close, but you're not actually getting any of the thing that that source of a governmental power has. So I think for me, it's become also a really useful way to think about how Jews understand ourselves in our relationship to systemic power.
I want to come back to something that you were saying earlier, but when you were talking about role playing, what I was thinking about was some of the pushback that we often get, or we sometimes get, when we encourage more play, more experimentation in Jewish life.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like the pushback is some version of, you're going to break it. You know, it's so, this is not stuff to play around with. This stuff has been around for 2,000, 3,000 years, and this is not for your creativity. It makes me think about the rules, the safety rules of BDSM, of kink of various kinds, that somebody is going to be vulnerable and something bad could happen. And so people take that very seriously and have rules so that that can be done safely. And it makes me think about, you know, back to the Binding of Isaac, right? That first of all, in that story, Isaac didn't have a choice.
Yeah, he's neither a sub. He's not opting into roleplay. That's like, to me, it's like a cautionary tale of the dom and the sub are God and Abraham, and they're using a third person. It's like really messed up.
Yeah, so that's part of it. And then what you were saying earlier about whiteness, and like that there's like, to some extent, maybe there's some choice there, but there's also people operating not out of full choice. They're just trying to survive. And so I'm just wondering what insights we might gain from the wisdom, the real wisdom and experience that comes from the desire to role play in one context, and try to bring that into our desire to role play in another context and say, actually, there are some ways to do this safely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a good question. I think that part of what I hear in it is a sense of how far the scene can expand, how much a scene, to use kink terminology, can hold. Because you're describing situations, Dan, in which people say, oh, well, you know, you can't expand Jewishness that far. You can't expand Jewish text that far. That's not where it belongs. But actually, in a kink sense, the people who decide where the scene begins and ends are the people who are participating in the scene. They're the ones who determine that, which is also to Lex's point about Isaac actually really not consenting to this particular scene that he's engaged with. Part of what I experience also in my role as the director of the New Jewish Culture Fellowship now, I encounter very often in that situation, because I will say, because the New Jewish Culture Fellowship specifically supports and funds experimental contemporary Jewish artists, a lot of what happens in that context is threatening to institutional Jewishness, which is totally understandable. Artists are threatening in lots of ways. From the perspective of the kind of resilience that I'm cultivating in this book and elsewhere, I believe that threat can be managed. It can be, we can handle it. We can handle that kind of threat, because I believe that the scene can expand. And in a lot of ways, I think that I believe so much in Jewishness and its possibilities that I believe it can handle even artists, even the danger and violence of artists. But it's a conversation that I'm engaged with a lot. I also think a really important text around it is Maya Epps' Kaddish for an Unborn Avant-Garde, which deals a lot with why and when Jewish spaces are willing to include artists, when Jewish spaces are threatened by artists, and why, how we might make more space for artists, to use Maya's terminology, artists as prophets, or the possibility of prophecy as one that might also come from an artistic position.
I think I'm noticing in real time how thoroughly interested we are in play, in Jewish play.
Yeah.
The word, it can come across differently in different contexts, in some it can come across as trivializing, like, oh, we're just playing around. It's a way to make something not serious. But we're interested in like an irreverent but very serious kind of play, because I think an unspoken assumption of our work is that actually the only Jewish creations, maybe not the only, like the most exciting, most enthusiasm generating, most justice seeking forms of Jewish practice that we're going to be able to generate right now are going to come as a result of collective and individual forms of Jewish play. Like, I think we're really invested in that. I do want to go a little into like some specific content in your book, and maybe a place to start is with, I think, maybe one of the most, I don't know if it's that radical or like provocative sides, but Nazi kink. You start the book by exploring your own relationship to Berlin and being in Germany. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book opens with a relationship that I had kind of in two parts in my early 20s and then a bit later on with a German man who I met in Israel when I was a teenager, who I wouldn't have used this terminology at the time, but who was a pretty extreme Philo-Semite, who was a non-Jewish German, I should say, who was very interested in my Jewishness, very interested in Jewishness generally. And also, and this, a lot of the first chapter is really concerned with my own confusion at the fact that someone who I identified as so conventionally attractive in a white supremacist sense would be attracted to me as a pretty stereotypically Jewish looking person. Investigating his Philo-Semitism led me to a real interest in both placing and displacing it, in claiming the fact that perhaps my difference from him might make me attractive to him, but also really trying to push him on what I felt was this kind of clearly historically inflected attraction to Jewishness, desire to get close to it from the place of growing up in Germany and dealing with what it means to be a German today. And I really started to push him on that. I really started to push him on calling me his Jew, on playing with the physical differences between us and noting those. Really, in part because I was trying to push myself. Yes, I was trying to push into kind of like what was beyond his attraction and why. But also, I was really trying to push myself beyond what felt to me to be really very stuck narratives, very stuck Holocaust narratives that I had grown up with about what a Jew is, how we in particular are threatened, how we will always be threatened, what role we play historically, these kind of very specific victimhood narratives. And I noticed that as I began to replay those in my engagement with this person, that they kind of started to loosen their hold, that something different was happening to me when and again, this is the way that I found role play as a more formal practice, but they began to really point out to me and point out to themselves how performative they were, how they might not necessarily be as static as they appeared to be, and that in engagement and an intimate relationship, I might actually be able to desituate them in certain ways. I'm trying to understand what it means for Jews to have become white in the United States and how we need to revise our own relationship to power, and perhaps even the stories that we're telling our children, or the stories that I was told about where our power resides and where we reside in our relationship to power, because it's changed. I mean, that's the, spoiler alert of the book, that things change. These things change, but actually it's very, very difficult, I think, for the human psyche and for group identity psyche to understand that things change. For reasons of safety and protection that I think are actually completely valid, we tell ourselves the same narratives over and over again in order to try to feel safe, especially when something as horrific happens as a genocide. So of course we need to tell ourselves stories about what happened in order to kind of try to integrate. But what I'm really trying to do in large part in the way that I'm interacting with narrative in this book is trying to invite the possibility that Jews are safe enough now in the United States. Most Jews are safe enough now in the United States to revise our narratives of ourselves, and that we might be able to risk more in terms of our activism, in terms of our relationship to state power, as I was saying, because we're not living in Nazi Germany. And I joke in the book about, how easy it is for me to forget that I don't live in Nazi Germany, even though I was born in 1985. But I think that joke tends to resonate with a lot of American Jews, because I think a lot of us feel that way and grew up that way.
I was really interested in a few parts of your book that I did not read as the Jewish parts. I read them as, pieces that could speak to Jews and anybody else. You explore, I think the term is naturism, but commonly called nudism. And you dive into this particular setting, this particular place in California, and its layered relationships, to capitalism, and also different people's experiences there, talking about how there's this insistence in nudist community after nudist community, in text after text, in all of this, that none of this is sexualized. And I read that from you as a little bit cynical. I read that as it is a little bit sexualized. And I will put my cards on the table. I forget if I've shared this on the podcast before. I was part of some naked culture in college. It's a thing that was the case at, I guess, our shared alma mater. And
I believe this is a revelation on the podcast, by the way. I don't recall this being said before, and I think I would have.
Yeah, and I'm bringing it up because I started by saying it's not really the Jewish side, and I will say I was really interested at the time and now in the fact that a lot of Jews were there in these nude spaces, and I also was struck by your, in my view, really incisive and true questioning of oh yeah, none of it's sexualized. But I thought that section, you really dove into a particular community and you unlocked the ways in which okay, there's some important countercultural things that are operating here that could be empowering. There's also really clear-cut ways that this intertwines with societal forms of oppression and harm. So I guess I'd love to hear about that side of the book.
Yeah, I'm glad that section resonated with you. A lot of this book comes out of this ongoing mediation between living in California and living in Berlin, and that is part of how that aspect of the book came in. But it also specifically came in because I was going to nude saunas in Berlin and also going to nude places in mostly hot springs in Northern California. I think a lot of the way that section fits into the book, and specifically the questions around power, have to do with the I find astoundingly intense human desire for purity, to be purely good. And I think a lot of what I get into in the chapters that touch on nudism and nudist cults has to do with their insistence that this is the way to purity. This is the way that if one is literally naked, that one can contact a kind of humanness that can never be evil, that cannot be kind of problematically sexual in any sense. It can only be good because it's just the body, which I also have always found a bit troubling. But this is the world that I think part of this book comes out of, is really a deep respect for the body as a source of knowledge, but also simultaneously a hesitation in any kind of extremism, any kind of sense that one source of knowledge is the only pure source of knowledge, which I think Jewishness also has lots of interesting things to say about. I generally think that any time that we claim that we are purely good, we're setting ourselves up for a really dangerous situation, because if there's only good and evil, then we're always going to be on one side and the other side is going to be evil, and we then do not have to humanize them. We don't have to respect their human rights. There are lots of situations that we're living through in which this is really relevant now. And that is a big part of what drives me to also explore in this book what it means that all of us are capable of touching evil, of being attracted to evil, of being in the gray areas of the sacred and the profane, because I think that's the only way to actually live ethically. I think that the division between the two is extremely problematic.
I'm curious about connecting your work here as an artist, as a writer, and your work as the director of the Fellowship for Artists. I don't know if it's part of your role to choose the artists or only to sort of manage them once they're chosen. But we've talked to a lot of artists on the show and a few people that sort of manage programs for artists. It's really interesting to talk to somebody who's both. I wonder how you think about those two different roles. Like, I wonder how you, as an artist, how you think about, what am I doing? What is the purpose of the art that I'm creating here? Why did I create this art and not that art? Am I actually trying to put this art into the Jewish world in a way that I imagine perhaps the writers of the Bible were thinking, that this is art that's meant to go into the Jewish world as opposed to sort of a more broad context. And then on the flip side, I'm wondering how, as somebody who decides which art are we going to invest in, we have limited resources, we have limited time. How do you decide which art is sort of worthy of that kind of investment from the community, especially when you're talking not about a mainstream Jewish organization that's almost trying to find art that, it's more prettifying, making stuff pretty that goes along with our agenda. But this is something very different. This is saying this is kind of avant-garde, or this is kind of the kind of art that might be scary to those institutions. And yet you can't say yes to everything. So how do you kind of decide what art is important art?
I think I'll take first the question of, or what I hear as a question of, why centering Jewishness in this particular work. And there's definitely a clear influence in the purpose of this book, and it begins this way as well, which is that when I was involved in kind of early Black Lives Matter organizing in Oakland, a lot of the work was happening through affinity group organizing. So a lot of it had to do with really turning back to each of our inherited realities, understandings, sets of knowledge, and how those in particular might be useful to organizing and collective struggle. And that is a big part of what influenced me to start from Jewishness in this book. My hope very much is that the book resonates with Jews, but it's also my hope that it resonates beyond that, and that I'm not necessarily writing a Jewish book because I want to center Jewishness, but because it's the place that I think that I can start from most authentically, that I can speak to most authentically in my own experience and build from there. I often say to my students in nonfiction classrooms, they're often so concerned about writing the specifics of their lives because they think that those will be inaccessible or uninteresting to other people. But then when they read one another's work, they often find that what they like best or what they connect with most is the most specific things that other people, the details that people give. And the universal often comes most out of the specific. There's both a political orientation to my centering of Jewishness and a sort of nonfiction craft orientation to it that I hope it's an invitation for people who aren't Jewish to enter the book through their own understandings of identity and inheritance. In terms of what I hear as sort of the second half of your question about my role at the New Jewish Culture Fellowship and what it means to select art, I will say, with lots of humility and hopefully a sense of humor, that I think in terms of what I was saying about purity before, I think there's no pure aesthetic decision when it comes to judging art. And luckily, I'm not the only person who chooses who receives the New Jewish Culture Fellowship. There's a team of us. But I will say that the New Jewish Culture Fellowship in particular, like you're articulating, is really looking for, I believe the language on our website is boundary pushing and risk-taking Jewish artists. So artists who are not necessarily welcome in Jewish institutions for other reasons, for reasons of identity or politics or these kinds of things. As I'm sure you guys are aware, there really isn't any money for Jewish arts in general, but there specifically isn't for this kind of risk-taking work. And I think that's part of why the mandate of this particular organization. And we also look specifically for people who want to grow in relationship because it's a cohort model in which people share work in progress. And that is a big part of what we do together is we build relationships in support of art making. So we're looking, a lot of the application reading also has to do with looking for people who have that kind of orientation, who are interested in learning with other people.
So this conversation has been fascinating. And I'm choosing that word on purpose, fascinating. Honestly, after reading your book, I'm kind of surprised that the title isn't Fascinate or something around the root FASCI. It really is almost like the chorus, the refrain in a musical sense of your book. We keep returning to this word fascinate, which connects to fascism, and you give us a Latin deep dive, and then we talk about plantar fasciitis of all. Like whenever you think that you're done exploring this route, then there's another step. I'm grateful to you for that. I use the word fascinating a lot, but I think for an English speaker, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I just use the word fascinating as like a synonym for interesting. Oh, this is really fascinating. But you got me curious enough that I looked up in Hebrew, like when I type in fascinating in Google Translate, but I was trying to think like, what would I use if somebody asked me to say the Hebrew word for fascinating? And what came up was a word to fascinate, lehaksim, which is really to do magic on, to make a hex. I guess I just kind of want to ask you to long form go at it in terms of this root FASCI and why it unlocks a whole lot in a book that's about kink, power, and belonging.
Well, I will say that the original title of the manuscript was Fascination. And unfortunately, we're not able to keep it because of other titles with that same name. But that definitely was my intention with the book, was to center the exploration of the word fascination and the expression of the word fascination and fascist and fascia and other words that come up as you're describing throughout the book. People tend to use the word fascinating to me to describe the book even before they've read it, which I just find really interesting, because I think as you begin to get into one of the first things that I found when I was investigating the word fascination is that it has this Roman root that comes from the fascinus, which is a Roman sculpture of an erect phallus that was used as an evil eye charm. It was typically placed under chariots going to war, to ward off the evil eye. And so what the fascinus did was capture attention, pull attention towards it, often in the text described as pulling attention specifically because it's funny, because it's obscene, because it is erect phallus, often with wings or other kind of elaborations on it. So it pulls attention to it and thus allows the evil eye to not be drawn elsewhere. And so part of what I am interested in this book is what it means to draw attention, when our attention is drawn to whom, who gets blamed for having attention drawn onto them when we think about sexual attraction and consent and these kinds of things. Also in the realm of attention as care, thinking about who deserves attention and offering an alternative modality in which everyone deserves our care and attention, not necessarily just the people who have won at being the most victim or who have to prove that they're victims in order to deserve our care and attention. So in addition to the fascinus, I write about fascia, as you brought up, which is the connective tissue between different parts of our bodies that allows us to move or adjust in small movements. So I'm using that also metaphorically in the book. What is connective tissue between different limbs, different joints? I'm also thinking about the word fascism in particular, which comes from fascio, which are these bundles of sticks bundled together, and how these sticks become much more forceful when they're put together. And these bundles of sticks were an early symbol of worker movements labor movements that then later led to what we now understand as fascism, Italian fascism specifically. I also use elements of the fasci root that connect to fascias, which have to do with bandages and bandaging and considering what it means to have objects on our bodies that draw attention to injury, that draw attention to places where we've been hurt. I also write in the book about fascinator hats, traditionally from British horse racing. So there are a lot of different directions, and I think I love that word. I love that I have a better understanding of it now. And I also think the trick of word investigation is not a trick that I made up. It's a very common kind of creative nonfiction, personal essayist way of into something. So that is one reason why I landed in that fashion. I also think, as a person who grew up multilingual, and I grew up with Spanish, English, and Hebrew. And so for me, words and their history and their possibility of twisting in different directions that's the language I grew up in. was that kind of confusion often, but productive confusion between words and sounds. And so for me, when I write a sentence or when I engage with a word, I'm always also questioning it. So that's part of how I developed this stably unstable relationship to the word fascination.
We've had many people on this podcast whose books are very consciously like visions of the Jewish future or ideas of how to implement Jewish communal change. Your book is not doing that, but there is a gorgeous couple paragraphs that starts to wade in those waters. And so I wanted to, we don't usually like read excerpts of books, but I think it's worth it in this moment. Here we go. Over the years of considering Jewish memory, I've talked with many leaders of Jewish organizations and scholars of Jewish life and culture. Many of them are intrigued by my pursuits, by how they've brought me so much closer to Jewish identity than I'd ever been before. But what is Jewish about all of this? One scholar asked me, if you're not engaging closely with the exact history or with religious or biblical texts. He put into words a fear that I have long imagined lies behind Jewish institutional brittleness. What will Jewish identity become if it continues to evolve away from tradition and toward reinvention? What will be left to pass on? Is it being watered down? And then there's a little bit of a break, ... imagine the ellipsis. Strictly circumscribing what it means to be Jewish has driven so many of us away already. To reproduce culture necessarily means to reinvent it. Because I've been given freedom here to really stretch the boundaries, I am more engaged with Jewishness and Jewish history than I ever thought I would be. I am fascinated. I have given up my power to refuse what presents itself. Would love to hear some more of that visioning from you.
One of the things I think that's most important here is that I was not an explicitly Jewish writer in my content prior to this book. Of course, I am Jewish. I'm not, I've never obscured that from my work, but it hasn't been at the center of my work. My work prior to this was a lot focused on chronic illness and disability, on writing about art, on kind of lyric engagements with guilt and responsibility. So there are lots of threads that relate to what comes up in this book, but it was not until I started to write probably my most transgressive, my most taboo-oriented book that I became so committed and so engaged with my own Jewishness. And this, I think, is reflected in part of what you read, in the sense that I feel much more engaged with what it means to be a Jew and committed in terms of what I spend my time on, what my job is, what I read, since I have been able to really push the boundaries of what Jewishness is. And in my role in the New Jewish Culture Fellowship, I come across so many artists of Jewish descent who just assume that they are not welcome in Jewish space because they are boundary pushers, because they are transgressors, in quotes, to use our earlier terminology. And so they feel pushed away. And this fellowship is one of the only Jewish spaces that they feel welcome in. And so many of those fellows, time and time again, because they are allowed to be their experimental artist selves in this space, suddenly become engaged with Jewish texts, with Jewish study. They work with Rabbi Matt Green as part of the fellowship. They become much more interested in communal orientations around Jewishness. And so to me, there's considerable evidence that if we make space for people to do the kind of investigatory, rigorous, considered work that you all are doing on the podcast, that many of the people that you speak with do, that this is what allows us to feel connected to Jewishness and to Judaism. And if we're told that we don't belong, if we're told that our questions don't belong and are too difficult or are too transgressive, then we won't be here. Then we won't be a part of the Jewish people. And I think that is really one of the major intercommunal and generational questions that we're facing right now, is how we handle that.
But not only that the questions are welcome, but that your answers, your art will be welcomed, even if it's uncomfortable for us. And then, the hypothesis is that actually a lot of the people will actually turn out to have answers, to have art, to have things that you will like, but they may not all, and you have to be willing to accept that. Otherwise, people can sniff that out, I think.
Those questions and answers that, in my case, artists are producing may be very challenging to institutional Jewishness, and they may contradict rules and mores and ideas that we've had about who we are, who we should be as a Jewish people. They may do that. I can't promise that they won't, but I do think it's the only way to actually keep younger generations even remotely interested in Jewish practice, to be extreme about it.
Yeah, what people always say, and it's become like almost said so often that it's like a cliche, but I think it's so true, is that like Isaiah and Jeremiah would have been kicked out of any modern day Jewish community, and yet they're in the Bible. How do you gotta be able to contend with that reality.
I love what both of you are saying. I want to push us. I mean, the framework of, if we don't allow boundary pushing, then Judaism will wither or not do well. I mean, it's true. I fully agree with it. And I want us all to get out of the defensive posture. Like, the reason why the experimentation, the play, whether it's with ropes or something else, like the reason why all this experimentation is sort of not bad is that if we don't permit it, then the thing will collapse. Like, that implies that, well, if we reach a moment where the experimentation is actually not necessary to preserve the thing, that we should just sort of stop and be more conservative in those moments. And I think that what I yearn for is not like a temporary spirit of experimentation and play Jewishly that will get us to like an equilibrium, and then we can chill. I actually want Judaism, and I believe that it has been historically, to constantly, perpetually yearn for the boundary crossing and the taboo making and the heresy creation. Like, I actually want us to either, I don't know if it's embrace heresy or embrace kink, or like redefine heresy and kink and taboo as not heresy. Like, I go back and forth on which of those two things it is. Like, I'm saying this not because I think either of you disagree with me, but because I think even those of us doing Jewish change work, even those of us calling for Jewish art, we so easily fall back into these impulses of, well, it's okay to do this because if we don't, bad things will happen, as opposed to, this is like the whole point of Jewish, like if it has a point, is to plant the seeds for creativity and experimentation that will better our world.
I really appreciate that invitation. Also, I heard you say that kind of away from the defensive posture. I really appreciate the invitation away from the defensive posture and towards the creative posture that I think you're offering. Maybe another thing that we could say is that we have to invite these kinds of conversations, because if we do them, then we can actually think together, to use your earlier framing, Lex. Then we can actually have the kinds of interesting conversations that we're having here, where we can produce new knowledge, new questions, new kinds of connection, new ways of connecting. So perhaps that's the more positive, generative meaning behind this kind of fearful or even regressive defensive position that is, like you said, it's so easy to take up, because I also think it is also an inherited position that many of us have. Is, I was certainly taught as a child of the 80s and 90s, like the threat of against Jewish continuity is everywhere. We have to do everything we can to make sure this bus continues driving down the road, I appreciate the invitation that you're giving me to even see how that's inhabiting my own language and positions now.
I'm thrilled, and like truly, I think I do it too. And I'm speaking as much to our listeners. Like, I think all of us, we fall into that when we want to be most, I don't know, persuasive or productive. Like we use the terminology that is more, I don't know, vanilla, for the sake of giving permission to that which we're doing. I am really jazzed about embracing frameworks of kink for Jewish conversations. I really think that this is a moment to be like, y'all listening, there's a reason we seem to pop up with these conversations one week with folks doing Jewish psychedelic things. another with folks saying we should question circumcision, another with folks teaching classes about Jewish witches. Like there's a reason why it may feel that we're kind of grasping at all the most heretical, all the most taboo, all the kinky kinds of Jewish thinking and doing. And that sense is that we really are in this moment of needing to play and experiment. And so as we close, I guess I'm curious to what degree you think that the Jewish world broadly might benefit from mobilizing vocabularies of kink, of power, of submission, of dominance in all of our collective graspings and wanderings through like how we're going to practice Judaism moving forward. Like, is there a way in which this book is both the content of it and a push for all of us Jewishly to follow you and apply kink to our own Jewish experiences?
I mean, I think it is important. It is important to me in understanding and in continuing to educate myself about the diversity of Jewishness, to say that in no way is Jewishness a monolith, and that my experience as articulated in this book may not for that reason apply to everyone. And I do go to, I would say, great lengths in the book to articulate that this is my way of handling something. It doesn't have to be for everyone. Hopefully, even if it's not for you, that it will bring up something for you, that it will ignite something for you. A lot of my thinking about kink in this book is also informed by prior thinking and prior education about disability and disability justice, which is important to me to name. And I think of a lot of the way that that pours into this book has to do with learnings that I had, that as a person who had chronic illness, who inhabited disability justice worlds, that I could be immensely flawed and immensely incapable in normative senses and still be able to participate and still be able to belong, still be able to engage really deeply, that slipping out of normativity did not mean that I could no longer engage in relationship and community. And I think that connects to our ongoing and earlier conversations about what Jewish community looks like, in the sense that we need to continue to make spaces for people to inhabit non-normative identities, and for those specifically to uniquely qualify them to participate in conversation, to uniquely offer something, which I think a lot of the things that you listed, Lex, are offering that in particular, to say that there's a difference happening here. Assimilation to whiteness or assimilation to institutional Jewish culture is not the goal whatsoever. The difference itself is what qualifies one to enter conversation and to engage. And I also think that part of my engagement with and learning from the histories of Jewish fear has to do with moving into a place where I am no longer trying to avoid disempowerment. And this again is a learning from Kink, that I could claim disempowerment as a particularly empowering, a particularly affirmative stance.
Thank you so much, Leora Fridman, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Before we close things out with our outro, a fun bonus, we have a discount code to purchase Bound Up. If you use the link that's in our show notes, the one directly to the publisher's website to buy this book, not Amazon or any other ones, you can type in RBOUND, that's R Bound, like Bound Up, and you can get a discount on this book. So don't miss out on that. We hope that you'll purchase Leora Fridman's amazing new book, fascinating, you might say, at the show notes on our website. Get that discount while you can. We also, as Dan mentioned, want to encourage you to check out our new Unyeshiva mini courses that begin in January, 3-week options that are absolutely fantastic. You can go to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more, and financial aid, as always, is available for all of them. We also love it when you are in touch with us, and you can do so via our Facebook or Instagram handles. Those are at Judaism Unbound. You can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. And you can email us, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We're also super appreciative as this year comes to a close, 2024 turning into 2025. If you're able to support us financially, it goes a long way towards supporting our work and helping us to keep this podcast available to you for free. And you can do that via judaismunbound.com/donate, either setting up a monthly recurring donation or a one-time gift. So thank you all so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.